The General Data Protection Regulation states that you must have a condition for processing data. There are 6 conditions that are described in the General Data Protection Regulation, and here they are in brief. Necessary for contract. So if you've sold me something, could be a ticket to an event for example, then you can rely upon that contract that's been created between us to process my information. So whenever there is a contract sold, you have an obligation to deliver whatever it is that I've bought. I have an obligation to adhere to those terms and conditions too. So I've got judicial right against you. I can take you to court if you don't lay on the event that I've paid for. Those terms and conditions and the contract between us enables you to communicate with me, but only about the product that I've bought. So if I have bought a ticket to an event, then you could talk to me about where the event is being held, what time to turn up. There may be some dietary issues, some health and safety issues to talk to me about. But generally speaking, it will only be about the product or service that I've bought from you. Incidentally, a donation is not a purchase, so you wouldn't be able to use necessary for contract if it was only a donation. But if I was paying for membership, for example, and it was genuinely a purchase and not a donation, then you could apply this particular condition, necessary for contract. The next is legal obligation. It's an interesting one in so much as if you've got a law that you can rely upon, then it will effectively supersede data protection. So very useful if you're communicating with employees because you've got employment law, but there often are other laws which apply, which mean that you can effectively set aside data protection and rely on that particular law. So if you've got a law, you can use that as a reason to communicate, and that could be across any channel that you have information on me, and therefore you could use. The next is vital interest. If you could save my life or prevent death, then you could communicate with me, and again through any channel that you wish. So it might be an epidemic, for example, or a disaster of some sort. It would enable you to reach out and communicate under that particular condition. The next is lawful authority in the public interest, but this is mostly about police, crime prevention, collection of taxes, so it's unlikely to affect you, or indeed unlikely to be a condition that you can use. The next is legitimate interest. Now this is a condition which has attracted considerable debate over the last 12 months. Effectively, your legitimate interest is the interest of your organisation to pursue your aims and objectives. So that means that every organisation has got one. It's just that you need to weigh up your legitimate interest against the rights and freedoms of the data subjects to which you apply it. There's a 3-stage test which you need to take into consideration, but generally speaking, we believe you'd be free to use your legitimate interest unless your legitimate interest was to be intrusive or annoying or inconvenient to the data subject. But these are difficult and quite emotive words, and so it's very difficult sometimes to balance the rights of the data subjects against your legitimate interest. And lastly, consent is probably the most popular, certainly the most transparent of all conditions, but consent has been reviewed under the Data Protection Regulation, and the bar has effectively been raised. So to demonstrate that you've got my consent, there's a 5-stage test that you're going to have to pass. This will mean, of course, that some of the consents that you've collected in the past may not be GDPR compliant. But to take you through those, the 5 stages are these. You have got to ensure that the privacy notice that I read just before I consented, and remember, consent doesn't necessarily need to be a ticking of a box, it could be me completing a form, for example, but the privacy notice that I read before I consented needs to be completely unambiguous. So I can be in no doubt as to the reason and purpose that you are collecting my information. So unambiguous is the first. Secondly, freely given. So you can't pre-tick a box, because that wouldn't be me freely giving my consent, that would be you assuming my consent. And equally, silence is not consent either. So just because you've written to me, if I didn't reply, that would be silence, that would not be consent. You cannot assume my consent. So I must freely give you my consent, which again may be me completing an online form on your website. Thirdly, it's got to be demonstrable. You've got to be able to demonstrate you collected my consent. And the ICO have said that it would be a good idea to record the privacy notice that was used in that particular instance and be able to demonstrate when I actually consented. So this is going to be, again, a very difficult area for a lot of organisations when they've collected consent in the past because they may not be able to demonstrate it in the future. My consent has got to be very specific. Again, a challenge for a lot of organisations. So gone are the days of a catch-all phrase that says something like, we'd like to keep you up to date with information about our organisation. That's not specific. You're going to have to be much more particular in your language. So if you want to talk to me about events, then tell me it's about events. If you want to talk to me about fundraising, then we're going to have to start using words like fundraising or marketing. And lastly, I've got to be informed. I've got to know what's going on. Again, back to that principle, that first principle of data protection about transparency and honesty. If you're being transparent and honest, then I will be informed. If you're not, then it's unlikely that I will be fully informed as to what's happening. There is another kind of consent which is worth mentioning, which is called implied consent. So there's a big difference between normal consent and implied consent. With normal consent, that would be you reaching out to me and me giving you my consent because I've read your privacy notice and I'm feeling informed, I've freely given it. So unambiguous, freely given, demonstrable, specific and informed. But implied consent is a very interesting condition in so much as I don't have to give you any of those things. You don't have to demonstrate any of those things. And the main difference between consent and implied consent is because with implied consent I will have come to you. So I will have come to your website, filled in a form or registered myself using my email address and requested some information from you. In that particular instance, you don't actually need to demonstrate all of those things we've spoken about. You just need to send me the information that I've asked for. So this is very useful when you are selling products and services. It doesn't work for donations and for fundraising. But if you are selling tickets to an event, for example, then implied consent would work very well. And the General Data Protection Regulation and with the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulation, if you read these legislations, we're of the opinion that it would be perfectly acceptable to carry on marketing information about that specific type of product or service that I've demonstrated an interest in. So if I've been to an event or shown some interest in events that you hold, then I think it's perfectly acceptable to send me further information about events that you may be holding in the future. However, don't be tempted to send me information about something completely different. So again, just because I've shown an interest in events, don't send me information about making a donation. It's not what I showed an interest in the first place. So be very particular and very specific. We've spoken a few times about privacy notices. I just want to mention how important privacy notices are going to be and how you're going to need to practice writing privacy notices so that they are completely unambiguous and very, very clear. Often in the past you will have read a privacy notice and weren't really quite sure whether you should be ticking the box or not ticking the box. Those privacy notices are the past. The future is going to be about giving people greater choice, about you being transparent and honest in your approach. The catch-all phrase is gone. You want now shorter, much more specific, just-in-time notices that talk to me about what you're trying to do, the reason you're collecting my information and the purpose for which you're going to use it.